Today I'm going to be talking to Azariah France-Williams, and we also have a couple of people to respond to what he has to say. We've got Rev Jarel Robinson Brown and Rev Rachel Mann, and all of you as well. Azariah has written this book, Ghost Ship: Institutional Racism in the Church of England. He's recently arrived with his family in Manchester. This is our first RMC Northern Zoom, I'm proud to say. During a pandemic, to be priest at the Ascension, the Church of the Ascension in Hume, which is an Anglican church, but it's also part of the Heart Edge Ecumenical Initiative. That's building churches and communities around the UK and globally, I believe. It includes St Martin in the Fields in London, and it's deserving of another conversation another time, but it's building its communities around the themes of congregation, culture, commerce and compassion. So Azariah, without any further ado, this book, if you follow religion on Twitter, everybody, you will be aware of it, but this book was a long time in the writing, and you knew in advance, of course, that it was coming out in July, but what you didn't know was that we were going to be in the middle of a pandemic, and what you didn't know was that George Floyd was going to be murdered in the United States. So what difference do you think that has made to the way the book's been received?
Hello everyone, it's good to be here. I think it's very important you mention the pandemic. In the pandemic, we realized that Black and brown people disproportionately were dying of the coronavirus. And so what began to happen, my inbox began to fill with invitations to lots of Zoom forums as people began to self-organize and say the mainstream health systems and our governments don't seem to care about us. Black lives don't seem to matter. And so let's get together and begin to work this out. So people were beginning to meet, and these were forums of fury. These were forums of looking back at so many cases of neglect. And when George Floyd was murdered, we were already gathering. And so we were already organized about the coronavirus. So after the George Floyd's murder, we were able to continue that sense of organization, that sense of anger, that agency, that claiming of the agenda, that Black lives do matter, began to happen. So for me, my book was arriving. I had thought this book was going to be like a boulder. I was going to have to push up a hill and then shout from the top of the hill, hey everybody, have a look at this. But instead, I had so many people help me to push this boulder, this book, up the hill, and then it began to cascade as one boulder within an avalanche of other boulders as people around began to realize that Black lives do matter, racism is real, and it needs tackling, and it needs tackling now.
So you've had a lot of positive feedback to it. Have you had a lot of negative stuff? Have you received hate mail, anything like that?
I have had a really wonderful response from the folks that have reached out to me. I've only had one letter which was carefully typed. It was 6 pages from a clergy person who felt that I was denigrating the church that he loved. And I wrote this book because I love the church. But the response has overwhelmingly been positive. People are saying it's a tough read. People are saying, you know, it's eye-opening. But I hope that through using stories, by giving my own first-hand accounts, as well as giving some of the history, which we so often forget, people can recognize that this is something to be engaged with. Whether or not you agree, hopefully it will get you thinking and provoke good conversation.
Well, you use the metaphor of the slave ship for the C of E, and you divide your audience in the beginning into some various cohorts. You're addressing the designers and captains of the ship, you're addressing the crew, you're addressing the slaves on the bottom deck, and you are cautioning prospective Black and brown clergy from getting on board. So explain on what, when should they get on board and when shouldn't they?
Yeah, so I'm on board, and if you're a Black or brown clergy person, once you're on board and once you realize what the conditions are it really does make you think. I knew I wasn't being recruited into Disneyland, but I didn't realize it was going to be the House of Horrors at times either. And so there was one point in the book when I was preparing it that I thought maybe maybe we should go on strike and black and brown Anglicans should skip some Sundays. And these were the sorts of thoughts I was thinking because I saw the level of suffering that had been spoken about and discussed, suffering that had been shouted about, but then so many people that were suffering in silence. That was an initial thought. But then others in my conversation said, you know what, God is calling people to this ministry, and it's not for you to tell them to go on strike. So I took that, and so what I began to think instead was, can people stop, look, and listen? Before they get on board, can they take stock? Can they look around and listen to the stories? I have a friend who, it took him 10 years from his first inklings of a calling to the church, to the community, to serve, 10 years, a whole decade, because he saw what people were going through. 10 years it took him to travel that journey, but now he's getting on board with full understanding of what he's getting himself into. And it's his sense of commitment to the communities that he feels he'll be eventually be called to, and that sense of God calling him in spite of the additional hurdles and challenges he knows he's going to have to face.
Well, it's 10 years since you were ordained. So what was your sense of calling when you applied for ordination training, and how has that calling changed over the last 10 years? I mean, I'm assuming that perhaps you didn't quite know what you were getting into.
You're absolutely right. If I can go back, so Anglicanism is very much a part of my heritage. There's an island called Nevis in the West Indies, and in 1643, it boasts the first Anglican church in the West Indies. And so my mother and father went to that church, my grandparents attended that church and were fully involved and fully contributing to the life of the church and the local primary school, St. Thomas's Lowlands Church. So this is my heritage. When my mum came over in the 1950s, there was a dislocation of that. The church that she went to was cold in temperature and cold in the way in which people treated her. And so because of that, she wasn't made to feel welcome. She found another church which was part of the Pentecostal movement. And there, she said, when she sang, other voices joined hers and she felt that she could belong there, although at heart she was Anglican, and so she missed that. So in a way, I feel that my calling was coming back to something that was part of my heritage and stepping back into a stream that had been dislocated. I like a number of theologians, and one of the ones I love is someone called Anthony Reddy. In one of his books, Churches, Blackness and Contested Multiculturalism, he describes how in some of the Black majority Pentecostal churches, people have a freedom of expression of body. However, there isn't a freedom of expression of thinking at times because of sometimes with the history, some of those types of churches, there's a conservatism which prevents free thinking. Said, however, within the mainstream, the more liberal churches, there's freedom of thinking, but there can be a restriction of body. Wouldn't it be wonderful if there was a church where we could express our bodies and freely express our thinking and our brains? Now I feel my sense of calling is not just outside of the church and demonstrating a God of love and liberation, but within the church, I feel that there's conversion that needs to happen. Repentance needs to take place and changes need to be made.
But did you, you told me yesterday that you had a dream or a vision or an image of yourself with a dog collar on, and did that freak you out a bit when you realised that it was going to be Anglicanism to which you were called?
Absolutely. So I was part of a Pentecostal church, and then what happens is that you can kind of move if you begin to move in your ideas of God and mission and the ways in which the scriptures are interpreted begin to shift for you, one move is from the Pentecostal church into the charismatic movement of church. And whilst I was in that, one of the emphases of that is an idea that you can access something of the supernatural. And I remember being prayed for and having this idea of myself. I saw a vision of me wearing a dog collar. And it did indeed surprise me. And did it freak me out? I don't think so. It gave me an indication that at that stage, even before becoming an Anglican priest, I was a pastor within the Pentecostal movement. And so for me, this felt like this was indicating a shift. And I think it goes back to what I mentioned with Anthony Reddy. I wanted to be in a place where I could have freedom of thought. And what I saw about the Anglican Church is that it seemed to be, there's a wide spectrum. I thought wherever my ideas about God and mission and the Bible lands, there's probably going to be somewhere for me to find myself.
But your director of ordinance for your diocese, while trying to put everybody else off, the white ordinance, tried to put the white ordinance off, saying, look, this is a really, really tough job, are you sure you want it? Called you back in afterwards and said, we need you. What do you think that person was thinking that they needed you for?
It's a great question. I've never asked them. I probably should and find out the real answer. My suspicion is, yes, it was. I was sat in the vicarage lounge. You really had a look of grim determination, trying to really put us off. And as the others left, he called me back in, and I felt in some ways he was part of the resistance. He was a white priest, but he was saying the Church of England needs priests of colour. It needs that. And I didn't realize what he was inducting me into. But as I say, I think he was kind of part of the resistance, trying to upset the apple cart. I think he saw himself as someone that could upend the status quo and begin to bring about some kind of change. I didn't realize that I was going to be some of the cannon fodder for those types of changes that perhaps he was envisaging, because the more I got to know him, I saw that he wasn't at all happy with where the Anglican Church had landed, and he was looking for and agitating for something which was more inclusive, something that was able to demonstrate it was a church not just of the English and the elite English at that, but it was a church for and of England.
Just tell me a very little bit about one or two experiences of being cannon fodder.
So one of the things is you are asked, if you're a black or brown clergy person, on fairly regular intervals to be involved in content creation, but you discover there's no destination for that. One example of that is where I was working on the staff of a fairly large church, which was multi-ethnic, and after receiving one or two complaints from some of the black members of the congregation, the white vicar approached me and said, I would like you to conduct a survey and find the people of colour within the congregation and have conversations with them and find out what they think and feel about how effective the church is in ministering to them. I thought, this is brilliant. And so with that mandate, I gathered other staff around me who were also people of colour. And we began to, over the next few months, began to gather people's thoughts on a range of things, from the relevance of the sermons to the church's social life and how it fit and how it worked with people's cultures and preferences, to things like the small group systems within the churches. Did it feel like it was home from home, or did it feel exclusive? There's a whole range of topics that we looked at, and we came up with a number of recommendations. And I remember taking them to the vicarage, knocking on the door. His wife answered the door, sprang up to the first floor where he had his home office. I sat down. He was in a swivel chair. He looked at me, and even before I could begin to tell him the excitement of the recommendations, he took the report, swung around in his swivel chair, and in one movement dropped the report into the top of his in tray and said, the Spirit is now saying, now is the time for unity, not diversity.
So he didn't even read it?
No, no, which I read as uniformity. But the thing is, there's a deeper story. Back in 1985, there was a Faith in the City report, which was set up by the archbishops and the government to really go into what was then known as urban priority areas, to discover what the real challenges and real needs were and what could be done to address them. And if you wouldn't mind just reading something of this. The Faith in the City commissioned recommendations included the establishment of a wide-ranging standing commission on Black Anglican concerns, which should be established for a minimum period, perhaps 5 years. The report also recommended this standing commission should have a full-time staff officer based in the General Synod. However, an all-white standing committee opposed the motion because it believed that the establishment of a commission would not help the cause of unity in the church. And so I find it interesting that what I encountered had a long history and had some deep roots.
It's a really jaw-dropping part of the book when you read that. It was the 61st recommendation, and it was the only one that wasn't adopted by Synod. And what I also find jaw-dropping, I don't know how many people were working as journalists then, probably none of us, but maybe one or two, was that actually, although you report in your book the absolute anger and dismay of people in Synod at the time, some people in Synod at the time, that omission, that failure to take recommendation 61, I don't recall creating any sort of stink at all. But you see that moment as a real missed opportunity for the church, which has not really made any progress in the 30 years since.
Yes, and we can go back further. I have this book here, Christianity and the Race Problem. It was published by SCM Press in 1924. And one of the reviews was this: race is the greatest of all practical problems facing mankind. It is the acid test of a religion that claims to have a gospel for all mankind. That review is written by the then Bishop of Manchester, William Temple. And so whenever the church says we have a long way to go, yes, in my book, Ghost Ship, I look at the last 30 years, but let's go back almost 100 years. When we say we have a long way to go, that's often the excuse. You know, we've made some progress, but we've got a long way to go. That doesn't wash anymore.
Mm-hmm. You speak in your book about working for a particular church. You call it the Delilah Church, a church of the enslavers, which breaks the strong man Samson. You're talking about a particular church. You don't name it. Presumably, it's not the only Delilah Church. That's part of what you see as the sort of institutional racism of the church, is that that's an experience that will have been common to many Black and brown priests across the Church of England. But just tell us a bit about that analogy that you're using, because it was very interesting.
In my book, I have a look at the story of Samson and reimagine that story, the ancient strong man, as that he was an enslaved Black person who the surrounding oppressors were those who were the white slave masters, and there's a real seduction. And the Delilah Church that I describe is something that looks shiny, something that says, particularly as I say, if you begin to shift some of your ideas about God and the interpretations of Scripture, and you begin maybe in a conservative Pentecostal setting, not all are, but some are, The charismatic setting is one where you feel, here is where I'm going to have some freedom. But only after a while, with a bit of digging, do you realize that that you are also part of the presentation of what's going on, but you're not part of the production of what is going on. And a Delilah church will extract and will use you. So for one example of my experience in a Delilah church was when I was asked to give my endorsement to a product that they had produced on mental health. It's a good topic and it needs to be produced, but I was told very clearly by one of the leaders there, we're going to be honest with you, and I commend them for their honesty. We'd like to sell this in to the black majority churches. And we realised that we haven't really thought about how to do that. Could you endorse it? And then that will help us to sell it into the black majority churches. And, I went along with it, but I also felt used in that too. The number of posters and pamphlets and booklets that I turned up in, maybe from slightly different angles to maybe give a sense that there was more black guys in the particular gathering or room, was ridiculous. And so you are part of the presentation, but not part of the production. And it can be very extractive of who you are. And so that's part of what I think about when I think about the Delilah Church. But if you want to know more, I'd advise you to have a look at Goshen.
But it was an experience of captivity. I mean, that's the point, isn't it? As
yes.
part of the Delilah Church, you were captive in some way.
Yes, absolutely.
There were lots of moments in the book when I was thinking, oh, I wonder which church that was. I bet I can guess, and I bet I can guess who Winnie Wonka is, and I wonder if I know who Bishop so and so was, or which diocese it was. You avoided naming and shaming. Was that more than fear of lawyers?
There was a whole chapter which in that chapter, it didn't make it into the book. I wrote quite honestly, and I remember going away to stay with some friends as part of my writing process. And I remember being in tears, writing and describing situations. And in that chapter, there were names and there were contexts for where these things had happened. As part of, but I realized that the process of writing this and experiencing this, re-experiencing this, was quite traumatizing actually. And so I think part of not naming and shaming is trying to avoid not being traumatized again by these places or by encountering the impact of some of these people. Now, people say, it's I'm now learning that we can judge by impact, not just intention, because some of these people and places may not have intended to cause harm, but the impact was harm. And so that's that's a case. But you mentioned the lawyers. I had a conversation with my publishers, and in an early draft of the book, that chapter was there. And my publisher very wisely said, those who have power are often protected, and those who step out and are vulnerable are often exposed. And my publisher gave an example of a book where some senior leaders had been named as causing harm, and the book barely made it out of the print before it was pulped. And so something else happened. I had to get more creative. I had to go back to the drawing board and reimagine these stories as metaphors, as archetypal, and as models of ministry, as instead of particular people. And actually, I think that made it a better book.
Well, I'm sure you can expect some private approaches from journalists here to see that chapter that never made it. But at the moment, perhaps when you're talking about having to rethink how you wrote the book, a good moment to bring in Rachel Mann, who's a poet and priest in the Diocese of Manchester, and I think you were quite taken, Rachel, with some of the genre styles that that were used in this book. Do you want to sort of reflect a little bit of that and maybe ask a question or two to Azariah?
Absolutely. Thank you, Rosie. I mean, firstly, Azariah, can I just say this is an extraordinary book in all sorts of ways, and I'm just blown away by its effects. But I have to say that when I began it, I found it a very disconcerting book in the best possible way. Look, I've read a lot of SCM books. I'm a theologian. I know generally what to expect from an SCM book. So I pick up Ghost Ship and I think, I know what's going to happen here. And then suddenly, almost immediately, you're in this mix of genre and voice. I mean, there's poetry, storytelling, there's elegy, there's testimony and interviews. There is analysis. And then there are these voices which you deploy, these persona like Brave Slave and Ade the Griot. And I'm just wondering, can you just unpack for us what deploying a variety of genre and voice enabled you to achieve that could not be achieved with a sort of standard academic book?
As I heard the stories, and firstly, thank you very much for that, Rachel, and thank you for the work you do and the way in which you unlock people's minds and encourage us all into a space of liminality where we can be transformed. As I heard the stories of those who were involved in the struggle. So as I spoke to people, like there's a lady called Glyn Gordon Carter, who's the first advisor for what the commission became, which was a committee back in the mid-1980s. I met with her, and as I spoke to her, and as I spoke to others who were part of that, that phase from 30, 40 years ago, I realized that they had done so much work. There was report after report after report. One of my sadnesses is that if you look at the Episcopal Church in America and look at their archives, you can trace back through the decades and see the Black and brown presence within the Episcopal Church and how that became what it is. If you go to the Church of England, a few years ago, you could have found the reports made by this committee, but now you no longer can find those reports. And so there isn't a memory for this. And in those reports, which are brilliant, it was jam-packed full of statistics. There was great thinking from the academy. There was real power. When these things were put together, you had some brilliant activists and real people who are really moving and shaking within the communities, bringing this stuff. And I began to realize, my goodness, I in no way can bring what they have brought. And they've brought all that they have brought, and yet it doesn't seem to be changing or shaping things. The book I mentioned of Oldham back in 1924, and a book that William Temple had written as well, their main summary was, we can solve race through education. And I think that we really got on board with that. That if people just have new ideas, well, then it will be solved. But, you know, nearly 100 years later, we see that that didn't work. And so I am dyslexic and dyspraxic. And so one of these things is, I attempted to do something that was more academic, something that was, but I just couldn't do it. I just couldn't get my brain to go in that direction. And so I just relaxed and relinquished that, that fight, and began to write something that I thought I would enjoy reading, something I thought I could engage with. And so I pulled on my inner artist and thought, let me create some art made of words, in the hope that, given that insider perspective, would help people to see things and build some empathy. And if they can see things through my eyes, perhaps that might be able to help them as they determine their own action and their own response.
I mean, it's really interesting, this thing about metaphor and voice shaking the ground, generating empathy. But then you have poets like Auden saying that, you know, poetry is essentially useless, or Seamus Heaney saying, you know, a sonnet's never stopped a tank. But I sense that for you, you sense that, I don't know, the persona of brave slave, about whom you might want to say more, you might not wish to say more, but that poetic voice, if it can't stop tanks, can maybe motivate people to move out and face down the Church of England's tanks on the parish lawns and all of that. Can you just sort of unpick that for me?
Sure. So, brave slave, in the last few years, through some family connections, I learned that on the island of Nevis, on my father's side, the family tree goes back to a West African slave called Aki, A-K-I. And as I contemplated, because on my father's side, that's where my story begins. It doesn't go any further back than that. There are no records for me to understand what my story and history was before that. And as I thought about Aki, recognizing that there was a brave slave there, someone who was taken out of their world, uprooted, and having to adjust and adapt to a foreign environment. And there is, I forget the name of the person now, but logotherapy. There's an understanding that, you know, we might not be able to choose our circumstances, but we can make choices within those circumstances. And as I experienced and encountered different things, I found that brave slave gave voice to what I struggled to articulate. So in a room, something wouldn't quite feel right. You know, they say with some of the understandings of neuroscience now that our bodies speak if we can learn how to listen. And I found through poetry a way to articulate what was going on. And in terms of leading or inspiring or leading people forward into action, I very much think that that words can open and unlock and energize and spur people on.
I'm going to interject here and bring in Rev Jarel Robinson Brown. Jarel's a chaplain at King's College in London, and Jarel, you crossed the floor from another denomination into the Anglican Church. What reflections would you like to bring to this discussion on your own experience and that of other Black and Brown clergy?
Well, again, like everyone else has said, I want to say that this book is such a crucial read. I found the pandemic to be a time of just so much reality, particularly for Black folk. And I think, you know, T.S. Eliot was right when he said that human beings cannot bear too much reality. And it's just been so intense a time. And I found the book at times really heavy going because of that. And just reading this litany of dates, encounters, committees, groups, all tasked with the same thing, failing, has been quite a challenge, I think. And to look out at the world and see so many people now who are tired and have had enough. And I think the thing I live with and sit with the most is, if change doesn't come from this, then we're really in a bad place, because I think we can no longer talk as though we don't know what the reality is anymore. And that for me has been a really big thing to kind of live with, that if this is not the place that change comes from, those who are protesting will become beggars. And once they're beggars, then actually anything's on the cards. And that's what I find quite difficult. But I'm grateful to Azariah for this book, because I think, you know, for me, coming into the Church of England, it really put all the cards on the table and said, you know, well, this is what you're coming into. Have no deception about where the church is in terms of race. And I think the one difference I would say between Methodism and the Church of England, so where I've come from, is that there is a kind of historical integrity in a lot of what Methodism has put itself behind when it comes to things like race. So, you know, lots of historians would say, for example, that the abolition of the slave trade may not have been possible without the Methodist campaign towards that, alongside Quakers and others. And I've always been quite proud about that. But at the same time, there's lots of what I read in Azariah's book that I know is true also of other denominations and not just the Church of England. One thing I kind of have been wrestling with is when Azariah speaks about the War and Peace Memorial and recounts that story and speaks about the fact that he says the sponsorship that we received prohibited my attempt to have that War and Peace Memorial in the way.
Just tell us very briefly what was that memorial, so that people who haven't read the book will know.
Of course, yeah, I will do.
Or,
it's in on page 1 if they do have the book. And Azariah is basically invited to a kind of opening ceremony, basically, where there's going to be a memorial put into the parish, a rededication of a war memorial. And he had pushed to have it called the War and Peace Memorial. But the sponsorship for it prohibited that from happening. And I remember reflecting on that and thinking about how, as clergy in the church, particularly those who receive a stipend from the denomination they're part of, you know, is it actually possible to work and seek the dismantling of a system that at the end of the day feeds you and houses you? And the real question I have for Azariah, really, and I think one that I have for myself, is how prophetic can clergy be when the institution that they're trying to challenge and dismantle necessarily, or abolish even, is the one that feeds and houses them? Does the prophetic voice in the church need to come from somewhere else? Maybe those who are in chaplaincies like hospitals or prisons, whose pay might come from a different avenue, or from the laity, more than those of us who are so deeply wedded into the structure. And I'll just be interested in reflecting on that with you a bit more.
Great, thank you. Brilliant question. One of the things that I argue in the book is that the structure itself is the rupture, and so I think that it takes all of us to have a look at this. 50 years ago in November, the General Synod was formed, and it was formed in order to get some independence or interdependence with the government. It felt very often as though it was at the behest of the government, and it wanted to have a level of freedom and a level of agency that it didn't have before. And that has happened. And so for me, it's difficult when groups represented, that should be represented by the General Synod, also ask for a sense of agency and determination in our own affairs, that same generosity, that same negotiation that was offered to the General Synod 50 years ago isn't expressed and extended to those groups. And it's, you know, it's not only Black and Brown members, those of the LGBTQI plus community. There's such a battle for women bishops throughout this. There doesn't seem to be that sense of generosity and hospitality for others to be able to work together and to bring about, because of a love of the church, the needed transformation in order for all to feel part of this, in order for our wider witness within the world. And so I would say you're right. I would say that it's going to take laity, it's going to take journalists, it's going to take campaigners, it's going to take legal teams, it's going to take a whole raft of people within and around the church to help us to have a look at this and to help us to begin to change and challenge this. So I imagine one of the comebacks could be that recently the House of Bishops has said we are going to have a commission on racial justice. But the details are not yet clear. There is a task force which has been assigned But I would like to see that this task force and this commission is fully adopted by not just the House of Bishops, but all the houses, that this is a set thing. I would like to see and feel that this isn't just dependent upon whoever the incumbent is, whoever the Archbishop is at the time, that this is an ongoing item. And within a pandemic era, when churches and dioceses funding has tanked, this is a real test of, will they fund this properly? In light of the fact that the church's finances are in a tough place. And so for me, that will demonstrate if people really mean it this time, because back in 1985, we were told we were going to have a commission then too. And so some of the people involved in the task force, I know, have got zest and energy, but somehow it feels as if whenever you get within this arena, your power and agency is stripped. It's almost as if you're the office intern. You might come in with all the best qualifications and experience, but once you step foot into the office, the way the office is set up, you don't have the power or the agency to make any difference. And so I think you're right, Jarel. It's going to take all of us to make this happen.
Sure.
Joe, you might have another question, but are there other people who would like to ask a question now? There's something on the chat there saying, why is this, I've just lost it. Why is this task force not being led by CMEAC? That's, is that the Committee for the Minority and Anglican Concerns, given that they have done the heavy lifting reports and research? I don't know if anyone's got the answer to that.
So the task force is going to be headed by the person who is the former national advisor for the Committee for Minority Ethnic Anglican Concerns, Dr. Elizabeth Henry. And so, so that's good news. But I'm still saying the structure is the rupture. And so one of the things I would say is, I would love the church to like the best people, not just the best people we like. And by that I mean, I've made moves with folks to say, maybe this body, this group, this consultancy can really help us think this through and work this through. But often the response is, well, we have someone that we know that we want to work with. So work with the best people, not just the best people we like, would be one of my responses to that.
Have we got any other questions? People would like to indicate if they've got a question, any of the journalists and others on the call. I'm just raise your hand if you do. I'll try and go along and see. Anyone? I noticed, Sanji, that you mentioned on the chat the possibility of external funding as well as church funding for the sort of work that Azariah was talking about. Can I ask you, I mean, where that might come from, or who those interested parties are?
So those are the two specific things I'm unable to say. But for a long time I tried to do this kind of work from within the church, and you are not necessarily silenced, you're just not platformed when you tried doing it.
Sandy, just tell us where you are now. You're at Cadbury's in Birmingham, is that right?
No, I'm not actually.
No, sorry.
Finished my contract with the Edward Cadbury Centre. The Minority Anglicanism project is finished. I am with Coventry University on one project and OU Law with a different project. And I'm hoping to get funding, which is a working project, to continue some of the race research. But I'm looking at external funders. I'm looking at independent funders that have nothing to do with church, which will allow me a little bit more independence.
Right, and do you see possible collaborations between the sort of work that Azariah has just been talking about with this commission and independent researchers, or is it a sort of parallel project, you think?
I don't know. So I must say I don't know anything about the task force. I know I get a lot of emails from people asking whether I am on the task force, not to my knowledge. So I don't know. It's a mystery at the moment, I think, and hopefully we'll see. Hopefully we'll see activity. Everyone's getting impatient, and I understand that. But with all the challenges that's happening at the moment, I'm trying to be as patient as possible to see what's happening.
Sanji, I want to say thank you very much for the work that you've been involved in, and that empirical data, which can work towards this. One of the things you mentioned in terms of not being silenced but not platformed. In the book, I look at that. Sometimes people think that racism in the UK is very bland. And I think it's a withdrawal of support instead of a full-on assault. And is that something that you have found or felt?
So I have to be really careful when I say this. I don't work for Birmingham University anymore, but I am bound by, the reality is, I don't know. I don't know. All I know is I've completed the work I had to complete. My contract ended for that particular project with Birmingham University in November. And I must be honest, everyone does assume it's the bishops in the Church of England who might try to silence this. That's not true. I think it's much more complex than that. And I think the academy is as complicit, and there are all sorts of, complicated relationships between universities and the church. And, if you have a personal calling, and I really have to ask for people's indulgence in, I don't want to be in any way repeated out of context or quoted on this, but when you have a personal calling and you're working towards something, and the institutions have things like ref scores, that is their agenda, and the church has their own sort of various interests, it's difficult to navigate all this. So I'm waiting to see how it'll pan out. And I must say that a lot of bishops have been very supportive of the work and have given me a platform. I've been invited to speak at the Disciple and Ministry Team conference at the end of the month, so I can't really hand on heart say I'm being silenced by the Church of England administration. I think that they will lose interest. I think this is the topic of the moment, and I think that there'll come a time when they'll tick the box and say we've done that and moved on, and that would be heartbreaking if we don't actually achieve transformation. I think theology is much more resistant to this than Church of England hierarchy. I don't think that the defense mechanisms are coming necessarily from the hierarchy as much as from middle management and the ecclesia, and that's the difficult part. It doesn't really matter what the bishops say unless the people who are the real lifeblood of the church are not behind this.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much, Sanji, for that. Can I bring in Ruth? Ruth Peacock, you've got a question, I think.
Thanks, Rosie. I just wanted to pick up what Azariah was speaking about earlier when you said that the structure was corrupt. And reflecting on your presentation at the beginning where you said that, that book was written in 1924 and for a century, for decades, nothing has been done. And hearing what you said about the failures of middle management just then, isn't this really a failure of leadership at the top? I mean, if the leaders at the top really wanted to make a change, they would make a change. There was a quick reversal on the votes on women bishops, I think, as I recall. You've only got to look at the A-level debacle this weekend. When the leaders want to move, they can move. So is it a failure of leadership at the top?
So yes, what I said was I think that the structure is the rupture, which means that in a way, I think even if there was clear and demonstrable evidence that archbishops and bishops were, and I think a number of them are on a process, I'm not sure how it would impact the next layers down. I think it's difficult to figure this out. And so one of my focuses has been on how do I recapture something of my own agency? What is my sphere of influence? How can I create a parish which has the tenets of anti-racism within them? What can I do in the world I'm in? Something a preacher used to say when I was growing up was, if you influence the world you're in, God will increase your world of influence. And so for me, that's what I'm looking at. The leaders at the top, I hope that they read and engage with these ideas, but I think it needs to cascade all the way through. But it needs for me, it's a societal thing, because the leaders at the top are part of other similar institutions with a similar demographic. I think that's where the lens and scrutiny needs to be.
Tim Wyatt, you've got a question in chat which sort of leads on from this. Do you want to put that to Azariah?
Yeah, I was just reflecting that, you know, when I've been covering debates in synod or writing articles in the church press and elsewhere, a lot of attention is paid on every time an ethnic minority clergy person is appointed into a role as a bishop or as an archdeacon or a dean, and there's a lot of kind of counting and trying to see, can we get those numbers up? Is that a good, I mean, obviously it's a good thing, but is that, if you're talking about structural systemic change, can that be a bit of a distraction, and we're just trying to kind of gild the lily by getting more black and brown faces onto the top table? And as you say, can it be distracting us from the real kind of systemic long-term change that's going to need to turn around some of these centuries-old structures that you're talking about?
Back in 1981, there was a movement set up called the Association of Black Clergy, and they had three aims. One was to have a black bishop, one was to have an office of black affairs, and the third aim was to have theological education where black people would feel comfortable and at home. And the chairperson of that was a guy called Wilfred Wood. And so those were some of the aims. And this group was very key in the Faith in the City. And so some of those aims went through into the Faith in the City report and what flowed out of that. However, there were some critiques of the Association of Black Clergy, and they said, very similar to yourself, Tim, they were saying that actually a black bishop would be symbolic, but would it actually change things on the ground? And so some of the critique was, we need to have black and brown based communities where black folks can get together in their churches and parishes and figure out what the needs are locally and have a sense of agency. And so the church would be resourcing and empowering their efforts instead of them giving themselves and their lives in sacrifice to the church in that direction. And so I think there's a good question to go back to some of the early critiques of the aims of something like the Association of Black Clergy, which flowed in, because I think we have had this focus on, let's have more black and brown faces, but if the structure is the rupture, actually there's more people who are exposed to more harm.
Okay, as a good old radio journalist, I think we're going to crash the pips in a couple of minutes, but is there anyone else who's got a last question? Would anyone like to ask a last question? Otherwise...
Could I do that? Is that all right?
Yes.
Just have one more thing about Azariah, actually. I just wondered, in terms of the spiritual dimensions of some of the stuff you touched on in the book, so when I read some of the responses you have from people, I'm left thinking, you know, some of these things can only flow from someone who has very little self-examination in their lives as leaders and very little prayer. And I wonder if there's a bigger question about a church that doesn't take discernment seriously, but also where there isn't enough self-examination or honesty about our sin as people. That means that people can say these things and not change and not be worried about that. And I find there's kind of a complete disconnection between what we say as a church and what we proclaim. and then some of the responses that people have who are leaders to racism and to injustice and inequality. And I wonder at some point when we talk about that as a spiritual problem as well as a political one.
Yeah, that's brilliant. About a year ago, I went to retreat to do some of the writing, and there was a senior leader there also on retreat, and so neither of us were in our collars, neither of us were there with any kind of rank, and we sat down for breakfast. He asked me what I was there for. I described my book, and I think something of the fact that we were in a neutral territory, we were there to strengthen, to nourish our spirits and our souls. I think that meant that we were able to actually have a peer-to-peer, human-to-human, heart-to-heart conversation. And I felt listened to in a way that I don't think I would have been if we would have been in another setting, another context, with our rank, our status in place. And so I think there is that need for us to be able to go away and find spaces of real depth of honesty. But one of the things I challenged this leader to was, he said to me, we have a black person on our committee, and whenever they're not there, we don't talk about race. And I said, why is that? He said, well, it's just never on the agenda. And my challenge to him was to put it on the agenda with his other white senior leaders, talk about the difference that pigment, power and privilege can make for themselves, but also for people that don't match their demographic. But very important question. Thank you, Jarel.
I'll just ask one last one. In the book, Azariah, you write an alternative history at the end, but if Synod in 1985 with Faith and City had adopted that resolution, what might have happened? And we can't go back and redo history, but if you were to throw yourself forward 30 years, let's just suppose the church starts to listen and starts to get it right, maybe beginning with its 50th anniversary. In November of the Synod. What would your hopes be for the Church of England in 30 years' time? What would you hope it would look like?
So one of the things is I can say 2 years' time. In 2 years' time, there's going to be the Lambeth Conference. In the book, I talk about the Lambeth Conference a little bit, how back in 2007 or 8, there was a plan for it to be in South Africa, but that plan didn't work out. I would love to see the Lambeth Conference be seen as equally valid as wonderful on other soil. For me, that would be a demonstration of a real value of the fact that we are a world religion expressed nationally instead of a private members club.
We are out of time, but Sidwell has just got a question. If people are able to stay for a couple of minutes, Sidwell is at St Anne's in Manchester. It's lovely to have you with us. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Rosie. And hello, Azariah. I know we haven't met, but we've been communicating by emails, and this is me. The question I have is a very small one at the end. You talk in the book, which I have here with me, about the unity of whiteness. I just wanted to find out if this actually refers to something maybe similar to the concept of apartheid, where I come from, which is South Africa.
So towards the end of the book, I look at something, the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, and so I go into that a little bit there. So maybe we can discuss that, and maybe we can discuss it together when we eventually meet. In the book, I look at the strength of social capital. I hadn't thought of it in those terms, but I think it perhaps we can think of it in those terms. Thank you for that, for noticing that.
We'll have to leave it there, I'm afraid. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Azariah, so much for being with us this morning, and to Jarel and Rachel for also joining us, and to all of you. We'll be back with another discussion next week. See you then. Bye-bye.